Hey y'all, I'm Angela, and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in March. So the first book that I read this month was Longbourn by Joe Baker, which is essentially a retelling of Pride and Prejudice from the servant's perspective. And I definitely had a mixed relationship with this book. There were parts of this book that I really loved, and then parts that I was less into. For me personally, I really liked the parts of the book that stuck more closely to the actual plot events of Pride and Prejudice. I felt like they really expanded the story of Pride and Prejudice, and I really enjoyed them. There were also points where they sort of diverged from that plot line and did different things. In particular, there was a romance plot happening that I was not super into. It was a little bit too much dark, broody man thinks about how feisty a woman is for me. I felt like this book did a really good job of adding nuance to certain characters, so particularly Mr. Wickham and Mr. Collins. I think it did a really good job of sort of reassessing the sense of power, the implications of a man like Wickham, for example, on people below Elizabeth's station is going to be very different than what necessarily Elizabeth was thinking about. And so it did a good job, I think, of enriching some of those spaces. The second book that I read in March was the Yiddish Policeman's Union. Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon. It's like an alternative history noir detective book. So it's set in a world where in 1941, Jewish refugees were given the ability to temporarily settle in Sitka, Alaska. And then also in 1948, Israel, like the state of Israel, was destroyed. The closest thing that exists to a Jewish state is Sitka, Alaska. And then this book is set in sort of the time leading up to the dismantling of that. So all of these people that at this point have like grown up in Sitka are going to have to move away to other places. And then it is following this guy called Landsman as he solves the murder of a guy that was killed in the crappy motel where Landsman is living. It's very much a book that, in addition to being about this murder mystery, is about sort of place and identity and all of these things that I really enjoyed and were really interesting. I had a hard time reading this book. I'm not a big noir reader, and I also don't read a lot of books by dudes. So I went back and did the math. Last year I read 6 fiction books by men, and most of those were rereads of books by Garth Nix or Brandon Sanderson. So this book was just like a little male for me, if that makes sense. And I'm not super proud of that, but it was the case. I read most of this book in like close to one sitting, and then I took like 2 months off and read the rest of the book. It definitely is one that I think the thing that I took with me the most was sort of the premise and the world and those possibilities. But yeah, so I really enjoyed those things, and I definitely really enjoyed reading this book, even if it was very much like out of my comfort zone and out of my wheelhouse. The next book that I read was Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I was reading concurrently with Yiddish Policeman's Union, so it's possible I would have liked both books more if I had not tried to read 2 books that felt very male to me at the same time. I don't know. This both feels like terrible and like it doesn't make sense, but whatever. Children of Time is basically, I've seen it described mostly as like evolutionary science fiction. So it is following this group of humans. They're sort of like the last group of humans. Humanity has collapsed sort of twice. So first off, humans like made it throughout lots of parts of the galaxy and did a whole bunch of stuff, and then they screwed up and they collapsed down back to Earth. So humanity has sort of been building back up on Earth, and then also we broke the planet. So this is sort of like some of the last humans going out into space, and they're looking for a place to settle, and they find this planet, but that planet is like an old science experiment from back before humanity collapsed. And basically they were trying to like do some evolutionary science where they like put a bunch of animals on a planet and then put a virus on a planet to make them evolve sentience. And so basically this book is about spider people, which the spider people parts are amazing. It's following the development of this spider society and spider culture over time as they go from like essentially hunter-gatherers to being able to like reach orbit. The book alternates from like a human chapter to a spider chapter, from a human spider chapter to a spider chapter, and I loved the spider parts. Like the spider parts were so fun. The technology was really interesting and really inventive. I thought that the sense of time was really well done. It actually reminded me a little bit of Homegoing, which is kind of weird, but the passage of time in the spider parts of the book was really cool and really powerful, and I really enjoyed it, and I just liked all of the spider parts a lot. As soon as I started reading the human parts, it was pretty clear to me that this book was just like not for me in terms of taste, and it ended up being sort of like the wrong level of misanthropic for me, if that makes sense. I wanted either more murder or less murder, and there was like a medium amount of murder. If I was going to go back again, I might try just having read the spider parts, and I don't know how that would work, but I loved the spider parts of this book and was not a huge fan of the human parts. That said, if you like the premise, you should definitely give it a try. Tchaikovsky is doing some pretty impressive stuff. And if the human stuff is to your taste, you're almost certainly going to enjoy this book. The next book that I read is City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert, and this one comes with a couple of disclaimers. Gilbert became really interested in women that like grew up in like the 40s and 50s and never married and were often told that they were going to regret it. And then she was like, but you go interview a lot of these women who like now are in their 90s and they're like, nope, it was great. Like, no regrets at all. So it's sort of like set around that. And then the other disclaimer, which is actually a disclaimer, is that this book is told with a frame story, which I thought worked okay. Some people definitely didn't like it, but there's a frame story, and so our narrator is telling this entire story to a person, and the person she's telling that story to is named Angela. So it was a bit of a weird book for me, not gonna lie, because it was just like being told directly to me. But overall, I enjoyed it. It was fun. It follows this girl named Vivian Morris who flunks out of college when she's 19 and is sent to live with her aunt in New York. Her aunt runs a theater, and so then Vivian just sort of like hangs out in the theater in New York in the 40s and starts partying, and that is basically the book. It's a coming of age story in a lot of ways, but it's not a coming of age story like in the traditional sense, because it sort of takes Vivian like half of her life to become a reasonable human. Vivian in the beginning is kind of a terrible person, but over time she becomes this like much more thoughtful and empathetic person, and that change is fun to see. The pacing was definitely like weird in a lot of places, but I enjoyed the beginning a lot, and I did really enjoy the end, and it was a lot of fun. It definitely gave off like Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo vibes to me, although it felt a little bit closer to the history for me. Like it felt a little bit more accurate, which that is not based on any actual fact. That is just based on the thoughts and emotions that I had while reading it. That said, it is definitely less gay. There's a point, and this is a minor spoiler, but I feel like the people need to be warned, so I don't even care. There is a point in the book where Vivian kisses a girl and then says, "It was the first time I had ever kissed a girl," and then never kisses a girl again. So don't get excited. It sounds like there's going to be more girl kissing, but there's not. Anyway, so it's like a less gay Evelyn Hugo in some ways. That said, because the book is so much about this experience of like single women in New York, in some ways I feel like I saw a lot more possibilities of what life could look like as a woman that never married a man than Evelyn Hugo. And it's not like a straight book. It's just not super queer. The next book that I read was Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne-Jones. This was definitely a reread for me. It is, I guess now would probably be classified as middle grade, who knows. It was like a children's book before any of these classifications existed, about a girl named Sophie who is the eldest daughter and therefore doesn't believe that she's going to be able to have any sort of adventures, but sets off to make her fortune anyway after she's turned into an old woman. There's a Miyazaki film as well, which I've like half seen once. I loved the book as a kid, so I wasn't like really able to like reconcile with the movie. I love this book so much. It's so sweet. It's so fun. Everyone is the exact right level of crabby for me. And yeah, I ship the main relationship so much. It's just a really fun, sweet book. And yeah, the next book that I read was Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi, which is essentially a metaphysical coming of age story. It follows this young Nigerian kid called Ada, I think. I said Ada in my head while I was reading because I'm very American, but I don't think that's right. Who is born and then grows up with gods inside of them. And so it's about a lot of things. It's about like immigration because Ada moves to the US and various kinds of trauma. There's basically trigger warnings for most things, but it's mostly about Ada coming to terms with all of these other beings that live inside of them and like what that is like at various points. Different like gods will sort of come to the front and take over her body, and then just various things. I don't know what to say except that I very much enjoyed it. And yeah. The next book that I read, I actually listened to it on audiobook, which was fun, was The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. I'd never read it before and I loved it so much. I always forget how completely up my alley Neil Gaiman is until I begin reading a Neil Gaiman book, and then I'm like, oh right, I love this. Also, because this book is middle grade, it is a little bit chiller in the beginning. Neil Gaiman has a tendency in his adult novels to be like, here is a person. Now, over the next 50 pages, we're going to utterly demolish their life in a way that is harrowing. But this doesn't do that as much because while like terrible things happen, it's middle grade, so it happens in sort of like that removed middle grade kind of way. So this book is about a boy named Nobody Owens whose family is all murdered when he's a baby, and he like manages to escape and run into this graveyard, and then, or toddle, because he's like a baby. But then the ghosts of the graveyard decide to raise him. It's super sweet. It's really episodic for the most part. There's definitely like an overarching plot, but a lot of the chapters kind of operate as short stories. I had so much fun. I always forget how much I love reading about like kids, especially shockingly kids like the age of my students, until I do. But it's so fun. Bob is such a sweet, kind child, and he's so thoughtful, and it was just a really good time. And then at the end, there was like this essay that Neil Gaiman had written about the experience of writing the book and just the ways in which he like kept trying to come back to it as he grew as a writer, and then realized that he'd like had gotten as good as he was going to get, and so he had to write it now, and it was a lot of fun. I really loved it. I really recommend the audiobook. The last book I read was The Assassins Apprentice by Robin Hobb, which is about this boy who is the bastard son of the crown prince, and then he's like brought in to the royal keep and is raised to be an assassin. It was my first Robin Hobb. It was definitely kind of dense, and it's also like very emotionally centered, so it's very much about our protagonist's like emotional journey, which I was really into and I really enjoyed. This was not the right time for me to read this book, in that given the current state of the world, this book felt too bleak for me. It definitely wasn't. It was definitely like the correct amount of bleak for me as a person, if that makes sense. But just because of where like I'm at and where the world's at, I kept thinking it was going to be bleaker than it was. I really enjoyed this book. I do want to read the rest of the series. I'm gonna, I think, hold off on that until the world is in a slightly different place. It's like a very insular book in a lot of ways. There's also definitely like a good amount of like child neglect, so if that's an upsetting thing, it may not be like the best fit. For the most part, I was pretty okay with it, although like they don't name this kid for a really long time in a way that was very upsetting to me. Everything else I was fine with. That apparently crossed a line. This is like a little thing and is completely indicative of just where I am right now as a person, because like my roommate's been doing a lot of sewing and things, but there's like a realism to the clothes that was nice. I feel like I've been reading a lot of fantasy books recently where everyone just magically has all of these clothes, and I'm like, how is your economy sustaining all of this clothing production? So if that too is a question that you have been asking, probably you want to pick up a Robin Hobb. That was this month. Overall, it was a pretty good reading month. I got a lot of reading done because I had spring break and then the world shut down. If you have thoughts about any of these books, please let me know in the comments. Particularly, I feel like there were a couple of books this month that I really wanted to talk about and had nothing to say except like, this book exists. So if you have things to say about those books, go ahead and leave them down below. If you enjoyed this video, let me know by liking it, and yeah, thanks so much, y'all. Bye.